Music, Will Smith, the luminous force of summer blockbusters. The fearless savior who stood between Earth and annihilation in Independence Day. The sharp-suited sentinel patrolling the unknown in Men in Black. And the shattered yet unyielding father who made the world cry with him in the pursuit of happiness. With a charm that seemed electric, a presence that could bend a room toward laughter or tears in a single heartbeat, he rose from the margins into the center of global culture. For years, he towered over cinema like a colossus, wearing the invisible crown of Hollywood, a living emblem of success, resilience, and hope for millions watching from living rooms and crowded theaters across the globe. From the early days as a fast-talking kid with a mic in his hand, clawing his way out of the streets of West Philadelphia, he etched his name into history as a worldwide symbol of possibility. Loved, celebrated, and lifted up as proof that a person can rise from hardship and turn it into power. But beneath that shining legend lies a history that is anything but glamorous. It is a landscape of bruises, grief, and choices that left scars no spotlight could erase. For so long, the world smiled back at his radiant grin, believing it defined him. Few sensed the invisible weight pressing down on his chest, the secrets he buried deep, the wounds that never fully closed. This is a life overflowing with victories, yet marked by storms. A life that forces us to ask if anyone, no matter how bright, can outrun their own shadow. And before we descend into that story, if you feel that Will Smith is not just a star, but one of the rarest talents of our generation, remember to show your support as a tribute to a man who has made the world laugh and cry. Even while battling battles most never saw dot, it is a bitter truth when the origin of greatness is not a moment of glory, but a memory of fierce sound that drowns out applause. The sound of love cracking under the weight of terror. That is where the journey of Willard Carroll Smith Jr. truly begins. Born September 25, 1968, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, he arrived as the second among 4 children. He grew up beside his older sister, Pamela, and his younger twin siblings, Harry and Ellen, wrapped in the rhythms and rituals of a working-class Black family. On the surface, it looked solid. His father, Willard Smith Sr., worked as a refrigeration engineer, coming home each day carrying the scent of oil, metal, and long hours. His mother, Carolyn Bright, served as a school administrator, her hands dusted with chalk, her voice shaped by patience and resolve. On paper, theirs was a steady middle-class home in the Winfield section of the city, a place that promised security and upward mobility. But paper cannot capture the tremors behind closed doors. Inside those walls, tempers flared and pressure built. Will's father was a man of precision and intensity, someone who demanded order and respect, whose presence could be both grounding and frightening. His mother believed in structure too, but her weapons were books and encouragement, not raised fists. Their marriage was like a fault line running beneath the family, quiet on the surface, waiting for the moment it would rupture. When it finally did, it carved itself into a child's memory like a scar. At 9 years old, Will watched a nightmare unfold in his own home. A shout, a blow, his mother falling, and a young boy turned to stone, rooted in place, unable to move, unable to intervene. In later years, he would look back on that night and confess that it branded him with a terrible belief, that he was a coward for not stepping between the 2 people he loved most. That evening was not just terror. It was a shattering of trust. The man he had looked up to, the father whose approval he craved, became both a protector and a threat. The child who idolized him began to carry around an invisible backpack of guilt, disappointment, and wordless shame. That fracture did not disappear when fame arrived. It bled quietly through the decades, shaping his decisions, his relationships, even the way he smiled for cameras. The Smiths were not destitute, and the neighborhood around them was far from the roughest part of the city. By many measures, they were fortunate. But security is not simply about money, and comfort is not defined by zip codes. It is possible to live in a good area and still never feel safe. That was the paradox of his childhood. Not poor, but never secure, night after night. Young Will retreated into the soft glow of television and the pulse of hip-hop, and there he stumbled onto a secret weapon. If he could be funny, really funny, if he could predict the tension in the room and disarm it with a joke, the dread might ease. If his mother laughed, if his siblings giggled, maybe the walls would stop trembling for a while. Humor became armor. Performance became a shield. The clown everyone adored was, in truth, a frightened child designing his own survival strategy. The charismatic smile that would one day light up red carpets wasn't born in pure joy. It emerged as a mask, a carefully crafted barrier to hide the chaos inside Dot as time went on. The cracks in his parents' marriage widened. Arguments grew sharper, the distance between them more obvious. In his teenage years, the separation finally came. The legal divorce would not be finalized until 2000. By which time Will was already a global figure, but the emotional break had begun much earlier. He chose to live with his mother Carolyn, who never married again and remained a steady presence in his life. A grounding force as he stepped into levels of fame that neither of them could have imagined back in Winfield. Yet even her steadfast support could not erase what had already been carved into his soul. Years later, he would look back and admit that so much of his ambition, everything he built, everything he chased stemmed from one driving urge: to shield his mother from harm. To rewrite the story of that night he had failed to stop, his childhood was not a gentle prologue. It was an initiation by fire, fear, guilt, disappointment, a household that looked intact from the outside, but was breaking apart one argument at a time. And yet, from that turbulence, he drew the strength that would eventually fuel his rise. The boy who once felt powerless in his own living room became a man able to command arenas and sound stages across the world. The early years did not cradle him. They tempered him. Betrayal became the forge where resilience was formed. Out of silence and shame walked a figure who would captivate the planet, but the child, his core never entirely left Dot. It is a different kind of tragedy when success first knocks. Not as a warm embrace, but as a test laced with humiliation. The opening chapter of Will Smith's career glitters and bleeds at the same time. In the mid-1980s, still a teenager with limitless energy and a disarming grin, Will teamed up with his friend from the neighborhood, Jeffrey Towns, known to the world as DJ Jazzy Jeff. Together, they created DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, carving out a space in hip-hop with tracks that were playful, narrative, and accessible. Their music swapped rage for humor, violence for stories families could sing along to. While much of the genre was steeped in anger and street realism, their sound carried levity, parents, school, summertime joy. Kids loved it. Parents didn't flinch. Suddenly, rap wasn't just an echo of the streets. It could live comfortably in suburban bedrooms and family car rides. By the age of 20, Will was living the kind of dream millions fantasize about. Concerts, interviews, fans reciting his lyrics word for word. Yet beneath the cheers lurked a quieter chorus of disdain. Hardcore figures in the rap world dismissed him as soft. Some critics labeled the music as watered down, too polite for a genre born out of struggle and rebellion. The streets that had first inspired him seemed to turn their backs. The sting intensified in 1989 when he and Jeff made history by winning the very first Grammy Award for Best Rap Performance. With Parents Just Don't Understand. It should have been the moment that cemented his place in the culture, a triumph broadcast to the world. Instead, the show opted not to air the new category, provoking a boycott from some of the genre's most influential voices. So there he was, clutching a golden statue that symbolized legitimacy, while a portion of his peers refused to stand in the same room. He smiled, as he always did, but behind that smile was a strange hollowness. Victory felt oddly vacant, as though he had been granted a prize in a room where respect had slipped out the side door. Success had arrived, draped not only in applause, but in an uncomfortable question. If the people who helped build the genre did not approve, was this really a win? That was the first harsh lesson. Triumph in public can coexist with rejection in private, and sometimes the louder the applause, the deeper the ache it hides. With success came money, and with money came seduction. At just 20, Will suddenly had more cash than he had ever dreamed possible. The driveway filled with cars that glittered under streetlights. Jewelry caught camera flashes and club lights. Parties blurred into one another, nights soaked in the intoxicating mix of youth, fame, and abundance. The discipline instilled by his parents clashed with the rush of unchecked freedom. Bills could wait, he thought. The next hit would cover everything. Opportunity seemed endless. Caution felt unnecessary. But one institution never loses patience: the IRS. By his early 20s, the illusion of endless wealth imploded. The taxman came calling, and the numbers were devastating. Debts, seized assets, projects frozen. The boy who had been posing with Grammys and enjoying the perks of celebrity soon found himself staring at bank accounts that had all but evaporated. He would later speak of that period with stark simplicity. He had been at the top of his game, and then, almost overnight, he was broke. Not metaphorically, literally, completely. One year, he was the fun-loving prince of clean rap. The next, he was a cautionary tale whispered about in studios and office corridors. That collapse cut deeper than any insult from critics. It taught him that talent alone cannot protect you, that fortunes can be built and lost with terrifying speed when discipline falls away. From those ashes, fate presented an unexpected lifeline. In 1990, teetering on the edge of financial disaster, Will crossed paths with one of the most influential figures in the music and television world, Quincy Jones, at a bustling party filled with industry power. Quincy looked at the young rapper and saw something more than a fallen star. He saw a presence built for the screen. In the middle of that living room, without rehearsal, without script pages, Quincy pushed for an impromptu audition for a new sitcom concept. Will hesitated, after all. Who auditions in front of a crowd with no preparation? But the choice was stark. Cling to fear or leap. He chose the leap. The living room transformed in an instant from social space into stage. There were no elaborate sets, no polished lighting, just Will, his instincts, and an audience that included one of the greatest producers of his era. He performed with the same raw charisma that had once lit up packed venues. Only this time there was no beat behind him, no DJ to back him up. Just his voice, his timing, and a desperate need for a second chance. Something electric happened. The room shifted. Laughter and energy gathered around him like a tide. In those few minutes, destiny changed direction. That night led to the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. In a blink, the young man who had been drowning in tax debt became the face of a new cultural phenomenon. It wasn't simply a job. It was a resurrection. The kid from Philly who thought his career might already be over now found himself embodying a version of himself on national television, bringing hip-hop swagger and family sitcom warmth into homes across America and beyond. The show turned his name into a household word. Behind the scenes, it also offered him a blueprint for rebuilding what he had lost, teaching him the patterns and demands of Hollywood. From ruin emerged a prince, not of royalty, but of reinvention. Hollywood soon placed a brighter, heavier crown on his head. Yet the more it shone, the sharper its edges became. Will Smith carried that crown with ease, or at least that is how it looked from the seats of packed theaters. The goofy kid from a sitcom matured into the action hero of a new era. In the 1990s, Bad Boys set off the first explosion, thrusting him into the realm of high-octane thrillers. Independence Day turned him into humanity's on-screen defender in the face of annihilation. Men in Black cemented his image as the effortlessly cool guardian standing between everyday life and cosmic chaos. In poster after poster, he stood front and center, confident, charismatic. Larger than life. To millions, he looked invincible. Every quip, every grin, every slow motion walk away from an explosion reinforced the myth of the man who could do anything. But fame, as he would learn, is not just a stage. It is a cage made of expectation. The world demanded that he always be the charming hero, perpetually upbeat, never shaken. Some critics turned that brightness against him, calling him overly polished, accusing his performances of being too safe, too eager to please. The joyful energy that once served as a shield was now, in some eyes, a flaw. He felt it. The weight of being seen as an image rather than a person began to press harder. Every red carpet appearance, every late-night interview carried the quiet burden of having to be on. He would one day admit that he often felt invisible behind the persona, as though the man inside was fading beneath the legend on the poster. That paradox, being everywhere and yet unseen, was a harsh, lonely truth. For a performer who had dedicated his life to lifting audiences up, the cruelest punishment was feeling that no one truly saw him, hungry to be taken more seriously. To reach beyond the confines of crowd-pleasing spectacle, he pivoted. He stepped away from simple blockbuster fare and aimed for something heavier. The role that became his proving ground was that of Muhammad Ali in the 2001 film, Ali. He was not just playing a character. He was stepping into the shoes of a man whose face, voice, and courage were etched into cultural memory. To embody Ali meant carrying the weight of history, of faith, of resistance, of legend. The transformation pushed him past his limits. He trained relentlessly, pushing his body into the shape of a heavyweight champion. Hours in the gym stretched into days. Punch after punch, round after round, he let his muscles burn and his lungs scream. He sparred until bruises mapped his torso and arms. He worked on Ali's cadence, his posture, his rhythms, chasing something beyond imitation, a sense of a man's spirit. Sleep became scarce. Exhaustion settled into his bones. Every day felt like battle, not only with the physical demands, but with the haunting fear that he might not be able to rise to such a monumental task. The result was a performance that earned him his first Academy Award nomination, a chorus of praise that finally acknowledged him as more than just a charming blockbuster star. Yet the cost was steep. He emerged from the experience not only proud but shaken, carrying scars that didn't show on camera. The applause roared, but he alone knew how much doubt and pain had been poured into every frame. For months afterward, he wrestled with the question of who he was outside the shadow of Ali, and whether the quest to prove himself had left parts of him hollowed out. Just a few years later came a role that tore open a different set of wounds. The Pursuit of Happyness, released in 2006, told the story of Chris Gardner, a father fighting against homelessness and despair while clinging to his son with everything he had. For Will, this was more than a script. It was a return to an unspoken vow he had made as a child, promise that his own children would never experience. The fear he had known. As he stepped into Gardner's worn shoes on screen, the lines between memory and imagination blurred. Every time he begged for a chance, every time he held his on-screen son and tried to shield him from the world's cruelty, he was revisiting that night in his childhood living room, when he had frozen instead of stepping forward. The tears you see in that film were not tricks of technique. They were deep, old emotions finally given permission to surface. The story earned him another Oscar nomination and deepened the respect he held in the industry. But for him, the real reward was something quieter. The work became a kind of therapy, an act of healing performed under hot lights, turning trauma into art, pain into empathy. By then, the world saw Will Smith as the rare star who could cross genres effortlessly: comedy, action, drama. But underneath the marquee lights, he still carried other kinds of weight: regrets about opportunities declined, doubt about the roads not taken. And in time, those regrets would surface, alongside new triumphs and new wounds, in ways that would shape the next chapters of his life. Comment 56, or write "Respect Will Smith" to honor him. For all the triumphs Will Smith had racked up, there was a quieter ledger he kept in the back of his mind: the roles he walked away from, the paths he didn't take. As his star rose through the late 90s and early 2000s, scripts came and went across his table, each one a possible fork in the road. Among them was an offer that would haunt him in hindsight: the chance to play Neo in The Matrix. At the time, the project seemed risky, strange, maybe too unconventional for a career carefully climbing the ladder of mainstream success. He declined, choosing a different film instead. The Matrix went on to reshape action cinema and the visual language of an entire generation. He watched from a distance as a character he might have embodied became iconic. An image that would forever belong to someone else. Another opportunity arrived later in the form of Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, a story carved in brutality and vengeance, set against the wounds of history. The script carried violence, moral ambiguity, and a tone that unsettled him. Again, he stepped back, deciding that this was not the story he wanted to tell, not in that way. The role went to another actor, the film exploded into the cultural conversation, and once more he saw a version of his life that might have been. These were not simple missteps in scheduling. They were the kind of decisions that linger in the mind during quiet evenings. Reminders that even the most powerful careers are shaped as much by no as by yes. He would speak, in time, about bad choices, about wondering what could have unfolded had he taken different artistic risks. Those regrets did not erase his achievements, but they carved out a space inside him, an awareness that he had sometimes chosen safety when he might have chosen danger. The familiar arc instead of the volatile one. For a man who had built his persona on being fearless, it was humbling to confront the places where fear, doubt, or caution had prevailed. Yet even those missed chances became part of the fuel that drove him forward. The hunger to prove he could carry complex. Demanding roles remained, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for another story to test his limits. Music. That next great test came in the form of A Father from Compton and Two Daughters, destined to change the face of sport. King Richard, released in 2021, offered Will Smith the chance to inhabit Richard Williams, the driven, polarizing architect behind the rise of Venus and Serena. The role was not simply an opportunity to showcase skill. It was a mirror. Here was a man both devoted and flawed, fiercely protective, often misunderstood. A father who pushed his children toward greatness while walking a dangerous line between shelter and control. As Will stepped into Richard's worn sneakers, he found himself confronting echoes of his own life, the tension between ambition and care, the cost of obsession, the complicated legacy a father leaves behind. Portraying Richard Williams demanded more than physical transformation. It required empathy for a man whose methods had been questioned and debated for years. Will had to sit inside the discomfort to understand a parent who could be both inspiring and infuriating in the same breath. In the process, his own memories surfaced: the rigid discipline of Willard Smith Sr., the tenderness and pain interwoven in their relationship, his own desperate attempts to protect his children from the storms that had battered him. Each scene in King Richard became both performance and reflection, a dialogue between his character's choices and his own. The film resonated deeply. Critics praised the nuance he brought to the role, acknowledging the honesty with which he captured Richard's contradictions, his stubbornness, his vision, his vulnerabilities. Audiences recognized the humanity beneath the headlines, the messy love that drives a parent to stand between their children and a harsh world. When award season arrived, the momentum carried him to the brink of a dream. He had chased for decades the Academy Award for Best Actor. For years he had been nominated, celebrated, admired, but that particular golden statue had eluded his grasp. With King Richard, it finally felt within reach. Music. Then came March 27th, 2022. On that night, the long arc of his career seemed to bend toward a single luminous point. Will Smith, after more than 30 years of grinding, reinventing, and bleeding on screen for his craft, sat in the Dolby Theater as his name echoed through the hall as a nominee. Around him, the biggest figures in the film industry waited with him under the bright wash of stage lights. The world watched through cameras and screens, sharing in the anticipation. When his name was called as the winner of the Academy Award for Best Actor, the room erupted into applause. In that moment, the boy from West Philadelphia, who had once used jokes to survive his parents' fighting, was being crowned by the very institution that defined cinematic prestige. The applause rolled over him like thunder. He walked onto the stage carrying not just a statue, but a lifetime of effort. The Fresh Prince, the blockbuster hero, the dramatic actor, all converging into one triumphant stride. For a heartbeat, everything seemed aligned. The kid who had once been broke and written off, the artist who had clawed his way back from financial ruin and artistic doubt, was now officially recognized as one of the finest in his field. But sometimes the highest peaks cast the darkest shadows. In the very same building, under the same lights that illuminated his greatest professional victory, a few stray words triggered a storm that would change his life. A joke aimed at Jada Pinkett Smith cut across the room, light on the tongue but heavy in impact. Years of pain, public scrutiny, private strain, and the complex weather of their marriage hung in the air around them, invisible to most. Something inside him snapped. He stood up. The cameras followed as he walked toward the stage. His face locked in a tension rarely seen in the man who had made the world laugh for decades. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but will be talked about for generations. In front of millions watching live, his hand struck Chris Rock across the face. The sharp crack of the impact sliced through the theater, silencing the buzz of conversation and laughter. Gasps rose, then subsided into a stunned quiet. For a brief, suspended moment, no one knew how to react. Was it a bit? A scripted shock? Or something else entirely? As reality settled in, as the enormity of what had just happened soaked into the audience and the world, the energy in the hall changed. The night that should have been his unblemished coronation had just been irrevocably altered. He would still walk back onto that stage to accept his Oscar, the symbol of all he had worked for, but now everything felt distorted. The gold he held shimmered under the harsh light of controversy. The words he spoke to the room trembled between pride and turmoil. That statue, earned through discipline, talent, and decades of sacrifice, became fused in the public mind with the slap that preceded it. Triumph and transgression collided in a single evening. The paradox of that night was immediate and searing. The highest honor he had ever received, overshadowed by the most shocking mistake he had ever made in public. Music. The aftermath was relentless. In the days that followed, the Academy convened. Headlines multiplied, each one dissecting the moment from every angle. Video clips replayed endlessly, slowed down, analyzed, captioned. Opinions flooded social media, news channels, and conversations across the world. The man who had once been loved almost universally now found himself at the center of a global argument about violence, emotion, and responsibility. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences eventually handed down its decision. Will Smith would be barred from attending the Oscars and all Academy events for a decade. He chose to resign from the Academy before the ruling, stepping away from the organization that had both honored him and now become the arena of his most painful public failure. Projects that had been poised to move forward suddenly stalled. Studios went quiet. Meetings were postponed, then disappeared. Scripts that might have taken him into new creative territory were pushed aside, their futures uncertain. The career that had once appeared indestructible now felt precarious, fragile as glass. For Will, the consequences were not just professional. They were deeply personal. Behind closed doors, in the silence after the noise, he had to sit with what he had done, replaying those few seconds over and over. The moment in which he had lost control would not stop looping in his mind. Nights blurred into each other as sleep became harder to find. The questions that tormented him were not the ones shouted by commentators, but the ones whispered by his own conscience. Why didn't I stop? How did I let myself cross that line? He bore the shame of knowing that in trying, however misguidedly, to stand up for someone he loved, he had inflicted harm on others, on Chris Rock, on the community gathered that night, on fans who had looked up to him, and on himself. He would later describe the experience as a scar for life. Not a bruise that would fade, but a permanent mark etched into who he was. He could not alter the footage or silence the public debate, but he could decide how to face it. Again and again, he stepped forward to speak about the incident through recorded messages, through reflections steeped in regret. His words carried none of the swagger that had once defined his public persona. They were heavy, halting, suffused with remorse. I was wrong. I hurt people and I regret it deeply, he said, acknowledging the pain he had caused. The apologies could not erase the night, but they revealed something about the man behind the myth. For decades, he had been the embodiment of confidence and control. Now the world saw someone stripped of illusion, confronting the ugliest version of himself in front of everyone. This was not the Will Smith of the Fresh Prince era, nor the invincible action star. This was a human being caught in the glare of accountability, trying to navigate a path toward repair without any script to follow. For those watching, his fall served as a brutal lesson about the stakes of self-control. It highlighted how a single lapse, a few unguarded seconds, can crash down on a lifetime of effort. Yet it also illuminated a truth that had always been present in his story. Greatness is not a straight line. It is jagged, marked by stumbles, by moments we wish could be undone. The slap became a symbol, not just of his failure, but of the fragile line each person walks between composure and collapse. In the quiet that followed, he turned inward. The rage that had erupted on stage did not come from nowhere. It was rooted in years of unresolved pain, about love, about respect, about protection. The same deep, driving instinct that once pushed him to shield his mother and his fantasies, to guard his children from harm, to stand as a hero in his films, had erupted in a way that no one expected, least of all himself. He was forced to confront the shadow he had carried for so long, the part of him shaped by childhood terror, by guilt, by the feeling of never having done enough when it mattered. His journey toward redemption would not be about convincing the world. It would be about making peace with the man he saw in the mirror. Through this, his humanity, messy, flawed, and real, came into sharper focus. The myth of the perfect hero crumbled, but in its place something more honest emerged. A man who could admit that he had failed. A man willing to stand in the blast radius of his own mistake and attempt, slowly and imperfectly, to rebuild. His legacy from that night forward would never again be simple. The Oscar and the slap would remain entwined, side by side, each one shaping how the world remembered him. Yet even in that painful pairing, there was room for the possibility that a life defined by both triumph and disaster could still point toward wisdom. Music, beyond the bright stage and the sharp crack of that infamous moment. Another story had been unfolding for years one. That began long before the Dolby Theater and would continue long after the spotlight shifted. To understand the man who broke under the pressure of that night, you have to return to a younger Will Smith, still basking in the early glow of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. It was the early 1990s, and his life seemed to be aligning with everything he had once wished for. He was a television star, gaining fame and security, and in the middle of that, he encountered a different kind of light on set, actress Cherie Zampino. Their romance was quick, full of the intoxicating optimism that often comes when two young people believe they can outrun any storm. In 1992, they married, stepping into what felt like a promise of stability, the kind of home Will had yearned for as a boy. Later that same year, their son Trey was born. In the hospital room, as Will cradled his newborn for the first time, the world outside seemed to soften and blur. The child's tiny fingers curled around his, and for a moment, decades of fear and shame seemed to lose their grip. Here was a chance to do it differently, to become the kind of father he had always needed, to end the cycle of brokenness that had haunted his family. That moment with Trey would remain in his heart, one of the purest victories of his life, greater even than trophies and charts and box office numbers. The quiet triumph of holding his firstborn eclipsed any roar of a live audience. For a while, it felt as though he had found equilibrium, laughter in the home, success in his work, a family he could protect. Yet fame, as he would discover again and again, is rarely content to stay outside the door. It seeps into every corner, long hours on set, relentless schedules, and the ever-present hunger of an industry that always wants more began to grind against the delicate fabric of their marriage. Missed dinners turned into missed conversations. Little absences accumulated into emotional distance. The demands of being Will Smith to the world clashed with his responsibilities as a husband and father. Cherie felt the weight of a life in which her partner's attention was perpetually divided. The house that had once echoed with uncomplicated joy began to resonate with unspoken frustrations. By 1995, just 3 years after they had promised each other forever, the marriage gave way. The divorce was not just a legal severing. For Will, it felt like a personal catastrophe. As a child, he had vowed that he would never allow his own family to fracture the way his parents had. Now he found himself signing papers that symbolized exactly that. He would later describe divorce as the ultimate failure for him, a verdict not just on the relationship, but on his deepest promise to himself. The pain radiated outward. Cherie had to grieve the loss of a future she had believed in. Trey, still small, faced a change he could not fully understand, the shifting landscape of holidays, visits, and 2 separate homes. For Will, the hardest moment came when he tried to explain to his little boy why things would no longer be the same. The bewilderment in Trey's eyes, the feeling of his son's trust slipping even slightly away, cut deeper than any review, any headline. Those images settled into his memory, heavy and enduring, another wound added to the collection he carried beneath the surface of his smile. Comment: 56 or right, rip Will Smith to honor them. In the quiet that followed the collapse of his first marriage, Will Smith found himself navigating unfamiliar terrain, that of a father living at a distance. Although he loved Trey with a depth that frightened him, love alone could not mend the fractures left behind. The days of waking up to his son's laughter were replaced by scheduled visits and awkward silences. The bond, once effortless, now required patience, humility, and time. He could make millions laugh in an instant, but he could not force his own child to trust him again. That truth hit him harder than any on-screen punch. Year after year, he worked to rebuild what had cracked. Through careful presence, long conversations, and the slow rebuilding of affection, father and son found their way back. Their reconciliation was not grand or public. It unfolded in the quiet margins of life. A shared movie, a walk, a hug held a second longer than before. And in that soft rebuilding, Will found a version of redemption more meaningful than any award. Still, the first marriage had left a mark. It taught him that a career could rise like daylight, while a family fell apart in the shadows. It taught him that success in public was meaningless without wholeness in private. Years later, he would carry that lesson into the next great chapter of his personal life, a chapter filled with triumph, conflict, devotion, and storms of its own. In 1997, 5 years after the unraveling of his first marriage, Will Smith stood on the edge of a new beginning. That year, he married Jada Pinkett, an actress whose fire, talent, and fierce individuality made her a force unlike anyone he had known. Their connection felt cosmic, a bond rooted in shared ambition, shared vulnerability, and a sense of partnership that seemed capable of weathering any tempest. Together, they quickly became one of Hollywood's most visible couples, a duo that appeared fearless, glamorous, and unshakably united. Their family soon grew. Jaden arrived in 1998, his presence filling their home with the kind of energy only a firstborn can bring. Willow followed in 2000, her spirit luminous even in infancy, her voice carrying the early whisper of the artist she would one day become. To the world, the Smith-Pinkett household looked like a modern dynasty, 2 talented parents, 2 gifted children, an empire in the making. For Will, these early years felt like a second chance at the life he had once feared he might never have. Bedtime stories, family jokes, moments on the couch when everyone breathed in sync. These were treasures more valuable than red carpets or studio contracts. But even the strongest homes have weather. As public fascination grew, so did pressure. Fame is not content to perch outside. It seeps through keyholes, crowds dinner tables, and stirs up the dust behind closed doors. Will's career surged, demanding travel, endurance, and constant reinvention. Jada's own artistic journey evolved in parallel, shaped by her desire to express herself beyond the narrow labels the industry tried to impose. Their lives became a balancing act, 2 meteors orbiting each other, each with their own gravity. In time, the private difficulties between them began to stir. Questions about boundaries surfaced. Rumors spiraled. Their marriage became the subject of public commentary, whispered speculation, and relentless curiosity. The world, eager for spectacle, projected its assumptions onto their every move. While cameras captured the polished image of unity, the truth inside the home was far more complicated. They were not breaking. They were bending under weight. The turning point came in 2020 during a public conversation where Jada described an entanglement, a relationship she experienced during a period of separation from Will. The word ignited the internet, becoming a storm unto itself. But the deeper storm was already underway. Years of emotional distance, unresolved wounds, and the tension of living alongside someone yet feeling far away. Will sat beside her in that moment, the pain visible in the quiet gravity of his expression. His silence was louder than any headline. It was not just a marriage laid bare, but 2 people caught between loyalty and heartbreak, identity and expectation, love and fatigue. Behind the scenes, the truth was even more complex. Since 2016, they had been living separately, still connected by family, history, and a deep bond, but no longer sharing the same home. Their separation, kept private for years, reflected not abandonment, but a long, winding journey toward understanding who they were, both apart and together. Will faced his old fear, the terror of watching a family fracture, but this time the fracture did not come with screams or slammed doors. It came with long conversations, weighty silences, and the realization that two people can love each other and still struggle to fit inside the same shape. For Jada, the struggle was tied to identity, the need to be seen as herself, not merely as a supporting character in someone else's legend. For Will, it was tied to protection, the instinct to shield the people he loved, even as the boundaries of what that meant grew harder to define. Pain flickered between them, but so did devotion. They were not enemies. They were simply navigating the rough terrain of a long, complicated love. The effects rippled into their children. Willow spoke candidly about the strain of growing up under intense scrutiny. Jaden voiced the desire for independence, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity, a need to build himself outside the orbit of fame. Trey, too, observed these shifts, carrying the wisdom of someone who had already lived through a parental split. Their home was full of love, yet also full of questions that did not have simple answers. Will and Jada never pretended to be the perfect couple. Instead, they allowed the world to see their fractures, perhaps more than they intended, perhaps more than was fair. Their marriage became less a fairy tale and more a living mirror to the complexity of partnership itself. They remained tethered not by a flawless union, but by resilience, shared history, and the willingness to continue walking together even when the path was uneven. For Will, Jada represented something paradoxical and profound. She was the love that strengthened him and the challenge that humbled him, the partner who both steadied and sharpened his soul. Their connection, and its beauty and its turbulence, shaped every corner of his adult life. And in the end, their story was not a lesson in perfection, but a testament to endurance, the kind of love that persists even when it shifts form. But before the public storms, before the Oscars, before the cracks in their marriage were exposed to millions, Will faced a different kind of reckoning, one tied not to romance, but to the man whose shadow had long loomed over his life. In 2016, Will received news that pierced deeper than any headline ever could. His father, Willard Carroll Smith Sr., the man who had both shaped him and scarred him, had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Doctors gave him months. For Will, the news was a collision of emotions, grief, fear, unfinished anger, and the faintest thread of hope that perhaps, in these final days, something long unresolved might find peace. He spent hours at his father's side, the two talking quietly about life, about mistakes, about the strange duality of love and hurt. The power dynamic had reversed. The once fearsome parent now lay frail, and the once frozen child now had the chance to speak without fear. In those final moments together, Will learned that forgiveness was not a magical eraser. It was a choice, a decision to carry forward only what nourished the soul. When his father passed, the grief was profound. But within it, Will found an unexpected gift, the chance to let go of decades of pain while holding on to the strength his father had instilled. The experience softened him, sharpened him, and prepared him in quiet ways for the storms yet to come. In 2019, another reckoning arrived, this time with his own body. A routine colonoscopy revealed a precancerous polyp. It was removed quickly, but the discovery shook him. His father had died only 3 years earlier from cancer. Now, confronted with his own mortality, Will found himself spiraling through questions he had tried to avoid. Would he face the same fate? Would his children one day sit beside a hospital bed as he once had? The realization dismantled the illusion of invincibility he had carried for so long. The man who had outrun aliens, robots, and cinematic catastrophe now found himself afraid of something as small as a cluster of cells. He had to rethink what strength really meant, not bulking up for roles, not sprinting across sets, but taking care of the vessel that had carried him through a lifetime of pressure. 2 years later, he launched a fitness series intending to reclaim his physical shape. But instead of a triumphant return, the process exposed him. Cameras captured more than sweat. They captured doubt, fatigue, and moments where his humor dissolved into raw honesty. He admitted to battling dark thoughts, fleeting but alarming enough to shake him. For millions who watched, the vulnerability resonated. It reminded them that even the most charismatic figures wrestle with shadows. He released his memoir that same year, titled simply Will. Within its pages, he reopened every wound, childhood trauma, marital strain, regrets about his career, the burden of perfection. Writing became an exhale, a way to purge decades of pain. Readers discovered the man behind the smile, fragile and human. And in the telling, he found a strange kind of relief, a chance to own his story before anyone else could twist it, comment 56 or write Rip Will Smith to honor them.